Credo Voices, the podcast where we bring you inspiring stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. I'm your host, Awele Okibo, the CEO of Credo Advisory. Nigeria boasts a vibrant young population, but for many girls, reaching their full potential is significantly challenged.
Our realities may differ, but our rights don't.
Limited access to quality education, unemployment, and deep-rooted gender inequalities hold them back. Alarmingly, the United Nations Children's Fund reports that over 10 million Nigerian girls are out of school. Insecurity, early marriage, lack of resources, and a failing educational infrastructure fuel this crisis. In this episode of Credo Voices, we are in Nigeria, connecting with Nabila Aguele, who is the Vice Chair of the Board of Directors of Girl Rising. Nabila is driving progressive policies, narratives, and movements aimed at promoting gender equality, innovation, and social inclusion.
Making sure that we get the rest of society to buy in, because it is not the women who must change, it is society that must change.
Nabila is advancing Sustainable Development Goal 4, Quality Education, and Goal 5, Gender Equality. Listen and be inspired by her transformative story. Today, I have Nabila Aguele. Nabila is a staunch advocate for women and girls, but she's also really involved in the international development space. Nabila, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Nabila, can you tell me a little bit about your recent role as a special advisor to the Nigeria's Minister of Finance? Can you tell me a little bit about what you did and some of the impact?
So I've had the honor and the pleasure of working with the immediate past Minister of Finance, Budget and Planning for 7 years, actually starting when she was a Minister of State. She actually is the person who brought me back to Nigeria. I had been living and working in the US for 12 years. I've had the pleasure of working with her over 7 years in 3 different capacities. First, focusing more so on national monitoring and evaluation systems. How do we ensure that our public financial management and our capital expenditures are geared towards actual impact? And I have a very publicly stated, unapologetic bias toward impact, toward sustainable development, and toward citizens, people, communities. So basic human capital, health, education, gender equality, poverty issues. So I really got to work with the national M&E system to say, how can we improve the ways in which the federal government tracks and improves upon its policy making so that it's results-based across all sectors. So that was really my first entry into the public policy space. And while I was doing that, I organically developed an awareness around international cooperation, first on the grant side and working with the EU, the UN, with foundations. And then eventually when we moved over to finance and when the former president merged the 2 ministries, I got to bring it all together in a role that captured both my expertise in monitoring and evaluation, performance management, results-based public financial management, and accountability systems and frameworks. And then on the other side, international cooperation, both from the perspective of multilateral organizations, development finance institutes, and really leaned in with this equity lens, worked closely with the minister, who is very much a gender advocate and a believer in women's empowerment.
Yeah.
As a standalone, but also as a precursor to economic development. I worked very closely with her to build out a suite of initiatives around gender responsive fiscal policy and public financial management that included advocacy that led to Nigeria's gender responsive budget, which sits with the Budget Office of the Federation. Also, I led from her office the development and initial implementation around Nigeria's integrated national financing framework, which is actually a United Nations tool. It's a global tool being implemented across the world to really allow countries to have a framework to think critically about how they are bringing in both public and private funds and leveraging those funds to actually achieve the SDGs. And
Yes.
Nigeria launched its INFF, as they're called, last year, and we were actually the first country to do so globally. The president launched, yes,
Incredible.
the president launched it.
Incredible, Nabila.
Yeah, the president launched it in New York last September on the sidelines of UNGA, which was really such a watershed moment. You know, when you're an advisor, so much of your work is unseen, especially at the policy
Yes.
level, right? Because
Yes. Yeah.
we're not on the front lines. Like, we're not in the communities. I'm not, in schools. Yeah, and we're not in health. So from the fiscal policy side, you're not engaging necessarily. You're not building schools. You're not developing
Hmm.
health systems. So it
Yes.
was one of those moments where we really got to see the impact of our work. So those are just two examples of some of the ways in which I supported the minister. But I really zeroed in on this equity lens and really with the sustainable development goals and partnership driven, integrated approaches as really my framework.
So I want us to unpack those two elements a little bit because Nabila, first of all, congratulations. It's not often that people who are doing policy work get to actually see the impact in the timeline that they're there and being able to see it on the global stage. I mean, that's incredible. But specifically, can you tell me what the challenges were? Because it sounds very easy. You were working with partners, you had the buy-in of the minister, you had strong advocates, there was a vision, there's a strategy, but we both know it was far from it. Can you just tell us a little bit about some of the process, some of the stumbling blocks? Bringing in a gender lens to policy is no easy feat. There needs to be like minds at the table. You need to even have a seat at that table. So, can you just share a little bit about that, about your experience?
Okay. So I'll start with the gender side because that began even before I moved to Nigeria and took this work on. And I think one of the first things I would say is that this is the lens that I've always had. I've always had a gender and inclusion lens. Even when I was practicing law, I was involved with the Women's Bar Association. I sat on committees around gender equity and diversity generally. So this was a lens and a perspective that I brought in. And when I came into the work, I learned very early on through some of the minister's engagements about this area called gender responsive budgeting. It was something that I wasn't familiar with. I'm not a policy person by training. I don't have a degree in economics. I'm actually, believe it or not, an intellectual property lawyer, a patent litigator with an undergraduate degree in human biology and a doctorate of
Wow.
law, which I applied in the patent space. So I literally came in and was learning as I go. And I think that's actually part of what made me open to some of these new spaces and integrating it with my interests. So on the gender piece, where it began was with soft, informal advocacy and conversations with the HM around her perspectives on gender within the Africa context, why it was important, really tapping into her innate interest and dedication to the space. Once I had that and I knew that she was somebody who would completely support and encourage and give me space, I then began the work of engaging folks at the time within the Ministry of Budget and Planning. And one of the first challenges was that folks were like, here she comes, this diaspora woman who's been living abroad her whole life. So
Yes.
the first challenge I faced was that people wanted to attack the credibility of the argument based on their perception of me, right? So and the way I addressed that was to say, look, I'm not going to use data from North America or Europe or even from other regions. I began to really dig into the regional data, the sub-Saharan African data, and also data comparing Nigeria to neighboring countries, to not
Mhm.
just countries that we consider to be our peers, but even countries that we wouldn't look at as peers, and would say, look, Nigeria is far behind on gender, period. not just compared to the West, but even within the African context. When we think about,
Yeah.
the 35% requirement, when we think about gender equity representation, maternal mortality, you look at our human capital indices, even though there has been improvement over the last decade or so, it's still not at the rate that makes sense. So that was the first thing I did, was kind of disarm those who wanted to label me as an emotional women's rights person. I am
Mm-hmm.
an emotional women's rights person, but I felt that in this context, the arguments that would be impactful and would be well received were those that were data driven and came from credible sources, sources that economists and budget people actually felt familiar. So the World Bank, the IMF, the UN system.
Yes.
So that was really helpful. So really starting small, not saying it's either I go big or go home, but beginning to win over allies and stakeholders, and also finding those moments. So I started that work when we were at budget and planning. We then moved over to finance before the president was reelected, and my focus shifted completely to revenue generation. The priority for the whole country and for the minister was addressing our domestic revenue issue. So for that period, the truth of the matter is I didn't do any work around gender because I had to focus on what was pressing and what was urgent. So I think the other lesson I would say is pick your moments and read the room, right? There's no point in pushing an agenda, even if it's the right one, in spaces where the priorities and the realities on ground
Are
don't make people
completely
willing to
different.
receive.
Yeah.
Exactly. So formally, I kind of scaled back. She would, whenever there were opportunities for her to advocate around gender issues through her speeches, through her engagements around women's leadership, etc., we would make sure to emphasize her view. That was that gender is a key enabler for the economy, for sustainable development. So it's not something that we should see as this niche area that is the sole role of, for example, a Ministry of Women Affairs. This is something that needed to be embedded across our fiscal policy space. So we continued to build that into her advocacy, but it wasn't until we came back and she was now Minister of Finance, Budget and Planning. And even then, it wasn't immediate because COVID then happened, right? And I think the great
Yes.
equalizer in a lot of ways was actually the pandemic. If you recall, because of the pandemic's really disproportionate impact on women and children across the world, there was this renewed understanding of the urgency of really being active and decisive around gender equality issues. And a lot of development organizations that weren't necessarily
Yes.
making the link between gender and the economy started to make it very clearly because the evidence was staring us in the face. So I was able to then ride that wave from the unfortunate pandemic, but really piggyback off of the great discourse and awareness around the shadow pandemic, as it's called, impacting women, and say, this is the moment. We have everyone's attention. Everyone is looking at things through a gender lens. So there's an opportunity to make some catalytic impact. And what was also very helpful was that we have still a DG budget, a director general of the budget office, who is an ally. This is someone who fully understands and buys into an integrated model, looks at healthcare, education, gender as key determiners of fiscal health and economic health. So that also was not a hard sell because the head of the budget office very much was aligned. So on the gender
Yeah.
side, those are some of the challenges. On the INFF, I think the challenge we face there is that Nigeria committed to launch an integrated national financing framework in December 2019. And none of us knew at the time that we would face this pandemic, the COVID pandemic. So the challenge there was that we had committed to something that was useful during calmer times. And then the country and a lot of other countries, all the countries around the world, had to go into crisis mode addressing healthcare, the economy, etc. And so what we did, and with the INFF, this is a multi-stakeholder initiative. So it's led by Ministry of Finance, working very closely with the Office of the Senior Special Assistant to the President on the SDGs, and has a steering committee that includes government folks, including CBN, but also the World Bank, the IMF, the AFDB, of course, the UN system. So a lot of stakeholders. And so those of us in the core working group, we made a decision that we're not going to wait to have the full attention of the minister and other senior colleagues who rightfully so are focused on addressing the immediate concerns arising out of the pandemic. What we did was we began the work at a technical level and really let the work speak for itself. And there were colleagues from some of these organizations who were like, we don't have the time to sit in yet another multi-stakeholder committee meeting and talk about these abstract things. This doesn't feel tangible. This doesn't feel urgent. But over time, because we were developing this framework alongside the COVID response and recovery, and also, if you remember, the crude oil crisis as well, right? So there was a dual shock that hit Nigeria and other
Yes.
countries. Yeah, we were able to develop a framework that makes sense for the current needs of the country. And that was another way in which we were able to get people's buy-in. But what I also did quite a bit of was advocacy. So engaging both regionally and domestically on the INFF, representing the team and the ministry, and really raising awareness, talking about this issue, helping it be front and center in people's minds, and also underscoring that this is a seminal moment for Nigeria as a pioneer INFF developer. And this is only something that can help us achieve our goals as a country.
What does INFF stand for?
So INFF, I think I mentioned it earlier, means an integrated national financing framework. And that's just a fancy way of saying we undertook a series of steps to develop a revenue strategy, an M&E framework, and other things that are
Mhm.
geared toward increasing our domestic financing envelope. So one of the biggest challenges we have is that we're not generating as a country enough revenue to
Yeah.
fund our national budget, which leads
Mhm.
to, issues around debt, and it also impacts what we can fund, right? So there are sectors that are underfunded. Human capital, so health is
Yeah.
grossly underfunded, education is
Mhm.
underfunded. And we know that for any country that is moving the needle forward, both with respect to human capital, basic needs, but also economically, there's a significant amount of money being invested in these areas. So what we did if to unpack what an INFF is that we undertook a series of stakeholder engagements, both nationally and subnationally, to get a baseline understanding of how Nigeria is looking at revenue generation, both through public as well as private funds. And then to say, given the status quo, given what our needs are, and given where there are low hanging fruit and catalytic areas. So, for example, tax administration is an area. Bringing in, how do we attract more international funding, investor funds through creating a better enabling environment for businesses, etc. So, really saying, what is the framework? What are the areas that government should be working on in partnership with the private sector, the development
Yes.
space, and civil society to unlock our full revenue generating potential? And for those who are interested, that document, the INFF for Nigeria and for other countries, is available on inff.org. And also, it should be available on the Ministry of Finance website.
Nabila, that's incredible. And I love hearing that you took a multi-stakeholder approach because government cannot do it alone. So it's really critical that private sector, organized civil society, it's so important that all of these actors have a seat at the table and are part of that solution, the design as well. From leading the creation of Nigeria's integrated national financing framework to championing a gender-responsive budget, Nabila takes us through her journey to achieving economic development through an equity lens. She shares her challenges and underscores the importance of allyship and stakeholder collaboration. Before we shift gears, can you just talk a little bit about values in having male allies? You talked about the director, the DG budget. Now, is this DG Ben?
Yes, it is. It is.
Exactly. I've worked closely with he is incredible.
He is amazing.
As you could have a critical mass of women who are ready, willing, and able to drive this performance. If there are men in these decision making roles that don't necessarily align to it, it really can be frustrating and impact your ability to deliver. So, can you just share a little bit about some of these allies? You don't have to share names, but just the value in having people like a DG Ben, who was clearly was critical in some of the success you achieved.
The truth is, at least from where we sit, women definitely mostly don't have the decision-making capacity. And also,
Exactly.
many leadership roles, especially in the fiscal and the PFM space, are led by men, which is why there's
Yes.
such a strong movement to diversify and create more room for women. Allyship is really, really important. And I would say, beyond allyship, just having stakeholder buy-in, right? The way I look at it is the ideal case scenario is someone like the DG Ben, who is clearly an ally and buys in from that sense of alignment. What I also found was, I'm a litigator, so negotiating and sort of getting a clear also understanding of what an opposing side, what their views are, what their values are, how they're looking at the facts is something that I'm primed for. And so I would say strategically, it's really important to not be so blindsided by your own mission and your own value set that you're not
Yes.
able to perspective share, to have empathy, and to really listen and understand where people are coming from. So stakeholder buy-in, even allyship, really, in my view, hinges on this ability to take a step back, to pause, and to hear and really listen for what are people's pain points, what are their maybe some of the underlying biases that are informing their perspectives, and what do they really care about, right? So if you're talking to somebody who, as often I have been, is in the fiscal space, is in the budgeting space, these are typically economists, finance folks, very numbers driven, very much thinking about tangible things. And oftentimes, sometimes, maybe increasingly less so, I think, as organizations like the World Bank and the IMF take more of an integrated approach to gender. But at least when I started this work, there was this sense of, this gender thing, let's put it on the back burner. Women Affairs is handling this thing. Let's put it on the back burner. And you, especially you, who you are not an economist, you need to focus where the economists are focusing. You need to focus on the numbers, on the revenue. And so when somebody says that to you, you say, okay, challenge accepted. So I think the
Nice.
key to building stakeholder engagement and allyship is working with a set of data and information that can be persuasive, and then applying, in sort of persuasive negotiation perspectives. There's a principle that I was taught in business school that has really stayed with me, which is when you're persuading someone, you're following one of two approaches, the push model or the pull model. The push model is, for example, to say, this gender stuff is really important and you are not an ally and you don't get it. And this is why men shouldn't be where you are. And, therefore you need to do what I say, right? So that's an example of the push approach. As you can imagine, that approach is not really going to get buy-in, especially from folks who are already primed to not want to believe that there's
Yes.
value and that they should focus their limited resources and time and attention on what you're trying to tell them is important. The other approach is the pull approach, right? And that is sort of pulling people towards you, bringing them closer maybe to where you are by honoring their perspective, honoring the fact that, say, for example, a DG budget, a minister of finance has a number of priority areas, a number of things that are pulling on them, and needs to be able to make a really strong case for how gender, for example, is integrated into their overall mission. And what has really helped is that there is a wealth of explosive data linking gender equality to increased labor participation for women and for others, linking gender equality to increased outcomes, better outcomes in health, linking, for example, education of girls to better outcomes both for that girl and also for the family. An educated woman, an educated adolescent is more likely to educate her own children, is more likely to participate in health seeking behaviors, is
Yes.
more likely to also be financially aware and financially included, and is going to have a spillover effect for entire community. So I'm lucky in that I exist in a realm where this data is there in abundance in a way that it wasn't, let's say, 10 years ago, even when I was first considering moving back to Nigeria.
And the data guides you, and everything in development should be data driven. But to your point around just the advocacy, meeting people where they are and listening, I'm such an advocate of ensuring that those two realms are incorporated in everything we do. Everything is, yes, the data, it tells us a completely different picture, but then in meeting and advocating with people who are affected, who are the decision makers, there needs to be that synergy. And it sounds like you were able to do that and do it quite well to have been able to perform at the level that you did, and in trying to drive a lot of the programs that the ministry had. Now, let's shift focus to the work you're doing now in your personal life. You are a board of director of Girls Rising. Nabila, can you just share a little bit about what they are, who they are, what they're doing, and your role, and what do you hope to achieve?
Girl Rising is this incredible nonprofit that really came out of a film that was produced in 2013. So, this film featured the stories of 9 girls from developing countries with really an intent to highlight why girl child education should be a fundamental right and is really important for each girl. And what I think was really special about the initial film is that it didn't come out of a development organization, it didn't come out of a government. It was actually a group of Hollywood filmmakers and producers who are very much impact focused, who said, this is an
Wow.
area that's important to us, and we're going to find
Yeah.
a way to tell these stories in a way that appeals to the masses. Because if we don't get the idea out to everybody, we're not going to have impact at scale. So the film came out focusing on 9 stories, had a catalytic impact. It's such a beautiful film, and you can, for those who are interested, the story vignettes are available on the Girl Rising YouTube page. So each story was written by a local author. Most stories were acted out by the actual girl who was the subject of the story. And then they were narrated by a group of Hollywood actors, including Meryl Streep, Selena Gomez, I think Priyanka Chopra, and others. So once that film had the impact it did, a group of the people who produced the film said, you know what, we want to keep this work going. And they established the foundation whose board I sit on. And so Girl Rising works at the intersection of storytelling and girl child education and empowerment, the idea of giving voice to girls, both through programs that they implement across a number of countries, but also through other initiatives such as the recently developed Future Rising Fellowship, which is a fellowship of mostly young women, but also there are men who are working at the intersection of gender and climate. So I sit on the board. I also chair the nominating and governance committee. I was the first international board member to come on board. So a first board member who's not based in America. So even
Wow.
though the organization is global facing, for understandable reasons, the majority of the board was based locally because
In
that
the
is the
US,
community of people who
of
would come
course.
together. So the organization has taken on this charge to diversify the board, both in ways that honor our mission, but also that bring in additional new perspectives from
Yeah.
the regions and the countries that we serve. So very excited to be working with the team and our board chair to help facilitate that.
Wow, Nabila, this is really, really inspiring. I myself am also an advocate for girls, for women, and it's nice to see fellow advocates really driving impact and getting involved both in private sector, in public sector. I could talk to you for hours, but unfortunately, we're running out of time. And however, I would love for this conversation to continue another time because I know you have other initiatives that you're involved in and quite passionate about. So thank you very much for your time. I'm wishing you all the best with Girls Rising, with your new roles, and let's have another chat soon.
Thank you, Awele, and congratulations to you and your team for the ways in which you're leveraging advocacy and communications for impact. It's such an important space, and I think it's really the key to unlocking and pushing potential in areas that we've otherwise not been able to progress in.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Nigeria continues to face challenges with gender equality and economic disparity. But extraordinary people like Nabila Aguele are working on solutions to make impactful change. Nabila isn't just talking the talk. She's championing gender-responsive fiscal planning and leading initiatives that empower women. Imagine a Nigeria where resources are directed to where they are most needed. Health, education, and yes, equality. That's the future Nabila is working to build. With over 220 million people, Nigeria can no longer marginalize half of its population. Policymakers and the government must be intentional in creating the enabling environment for gender parity. Through targeted investments in education, skills training, and entrepreneurship, Nigerian women can be enabled to fully participate in the larger society, unlocking their potential for the benefit of all. Thank you for listening. Until next time, stay curious and keep believing in the power of your voice. This is Awele Okibo, signing off for Credo Voices.